Hi everyone, my name is Sarah Silverman. I am a licensed social worker. I'm also a board certified music therapist. I am a clinical therapist. I work with individuals. I see preteens, teens, adults, basically ages 12 and up. And today I'm going to be talking to you about mental health and substance use. So first, talking about mental health, let's talk about some definitions. So you're going to be hearing me refer to mental health as a few different ways throughout this webinar. So mental health itself is something different than a mental health disorder. So mental health is something that everyone has. It is a state of emotional well-being. So we can be feeling good, or mental health can be well and healthy, or we can be going through moments of just hard times. We're feeling sad, we're feeling down, having a hard time, unwell mental health. And that is different than having a mental health disorder. So a mental health disorder is when someone's mental health is impacting their daily functioning. It's making it so they can't go throughout their day. It could be hurting them. It could be hurting others around them. So this is what's kind of talking about mental health stuff, just to talk about some current trends that we're seeing with mental health. So we're seeing younger and younger ages having a difficult time with both just the mental health in general and also being diagnosed with mental health disorders. I would also be amiss if I did not mention COVID-19, which has had such a huge impact on mental health. This has impacted people of all ages. So we have children who school was different, it was confusing, maybe they didn't quite understand what was going on. We had teenagers who were missing some really important milestones, proms and graduations, not getting to see friends. We had adults who had a difficult time with what was going on with their work, worrying about their families. And then we have people who are elderly, who we know that population already has a difficult time with being isolated, feeling alone. COVID-19 made that a lot harder for them. We also see how social media has had a huge negative impact on mental health. Something that's interesting about these three things, younger and younger ages, COVID-19, and social media, is that these things have also had an impact on substance use. And we'll kind of talk about that a little more in a bit. When we're thinking about mental health and mental health disorders, we often think about coping skills. So coping skills are the way people just help themselves feel better. How do they get through this moment? We have both healthy and unhealthy coping skills. So generally, healthy coping skills is going to be something someone does that makes them feel better in the moment, short-term relief, and also long-term, it doesn't cause more problems. It can maybe helps kind of fix the problem. Unhealthy coping skills, on the other hand, are going to be when short-term relief happens, it makes them kind of get through the moment, makes them feel better, but either the problem gets worse afterwards or it creates a whole nother set of problems long-term. So, for example, substance use is an unhealthy coping skill. It is a way someone can maybe cope with something going on, feel better, but long-term, it's going to create more issues. Substance use is not the only unhealthy coping skill. There are a ton out there, but just some examples. Self-harm is one. People who are maybe overeating or oversleeping, those are also unhealthy coping skills. Just generally trying to just avoid things, sometimes can help, other times can become an unhealthy coping skill. So that was a little bit about mental health. Let's talk a little bit about substance use. So the definition of substance use is the use of a substance. That could be alcohol, tobacco, nicotine, other drugs like illicit drugs. It can be taken in a variety of ways. Substance use itself is different than substance misuse. So substance misuse is just that, when someone is misusing a substance. So that can look different in a variety of ways. So when we talk about substance use itself, so someone who has a prescription from a doctor and they take that prescription as prescribed, they are using a substance. Not a bad thing. Someone over the age of 21 occasionally having a drink, not necessarily a bad thing. Substance misuse, on the other hand, can be taking someone else's prescription. So someone is taking a prescription that is not given to them, that is misuse. It can be someone who is taking their own prescription, but they are not taking it as prescribed. So maybe they're supposed to take 1 pill every 8 hours, but they're taking 2 pills every 4 hours. That is misuse. Anyone who's using a substance that is illegal, that is misuse. Anyone under the age of 21 drinking, that is misuse. So it's kind of like different levels here. We have substance use, which doesn't necessarily mean it's a bad thing happening. Substance misuse means it's not a good thing that's going on. And then we have substance use disorder. So just like we have mental health and mental health disorders, we have substance use and misuse and a substance use disorder. So substance use and misuse turns into a disorder when it is impairing their functioning, when it is hurting themselves, it's hurting others around them. Substance use disorder may be a new term for some people. We used to say substance abuse, but we have kind of turned away from that terminology, and instead of saying abuse, we are now saying substance use. In a bit, I'm going to go a lot more in depth into why our language is important and about how stigmas impacts people who are using substances. But the main reason we're using this term now, substance use disorder, is because we want individuals who are having a problem, we want them to want to reach out for help, and a stigma is not going to help them do that. So when we think substance abuse, for some people that was kind of bringing up this images of like, this is a moral failing. It's not a moral failing now that we know that this isn't someone is a bad person. We know that this is a disorder, this is a disease. And before we just kind of dive into the rest of the webinar, I want to point out that when we're talking about statistics with substance use, it is very hard to get an accurate picture of what is actually going on. So just to kind of give you an example, say we're trying to track a certain type of cancer. That is easier to track because someone is feeling sick, they go to the doctor, they get a diagnosis, that goes into their chart, and we can kind of track, people who have a certain type of cancer. With substance use, misuse, and substance use disorder, we don't always know people who are having this issue going on. There may be people who never seek treatments. There may be people who kind of keep it hidden. It can often be a hidden disease. So statistics that we kind of have and statistics that I'm going to present to you, just kind of keep in mind and always take these statistics with a grain of salt of that the picture is probably, unfortunately, worse than what statistics show, and there's probably just more widespread usage than what we really know is going on. So to talk about kind of some statistics, I want to talk about who is at a risk for misusing substances and having a substance use disorder. So I want you to just take a moment and just reflect on when you think about those who are at risk, meaning who are those who are more likely to use based on maybe things that are going on in their lives or things about them. So I want you to take a moment and think about that, whether you want to kind of pause this and really take a moment to think about it or just kind of think about it quickly. Who is at a high risk of using substances? So I'll give you a moment to think about that. All right, so to start off, this that I'm presenting to you is from a survey done by the National Survey on Drug Use and Health. Something that was unique and I thought was cool about these statistics and kind of how this survey was done was that it was sent to a variety of households and done in a completely anonymous way. So this gives us a little bit of a bigger picture of what's going on because if people are afraid that they admit that they're using substances, that they're going to get in legal trouble, they're going to get caught, they're going to have consequences, they're less likely to be honest. So this hopefully gave just a little more honest answers. So the first risk factor that I talked about is deviant behaviors. Deviant behaviors refers to when someone is behaving in a way that is just different than like the norms of society, what we expect for how people to behave. So that can be things like stealing, fighting, failing classes, cheating, those kind of behaviors. The thing that's a little difficult about that is it's kind of like a chicken or the egg situation. So did these deviant behaviors, stealing, fighting, did that happen first and then someone started to use substances? Or was someone using and misusing substances that then led to deviant behaviors occurring? The next risk factor that I talked about is living in poor neighborhoods. So this showed that individuals who live in poor neighborhoods, so they're around that environment, or they're also in poverty themselves, they're then at a higher risk. They're more likely to use substances than those who do not. So for gender, so this survey showed that specifically for alcohol, cocaine, tobacco, and marijuana, males were more likely than females to use substances and be at that risk of using. So race. So this was interesting. So people typically have a perception that individuals who are at the risk of using, when thinking about race, are people of color, particularly individuals who identify as Hispanic or Black. This survey showed, and especially for alcohol, cocaine, and tobacco, that people who identify as white or Caucasian were at that higher risk of using. Now, this clashes with many people's perceptions, and this probably comes from how the survey was done. So this was sent anonymously to such a variety of households. Oftentimes, our statistics could come from people who have a drug-related charge, or people who were arrested for using substances. So unfortunately, we know that certain neighborhoods have a higher police presence, and if there's a higher police presence happening, there is more likely people to be arrested for using substances. So kind of statistics coming from just people who are being arrested for using substances is really skewing the statistics, skewing the data, and not giving an accurate picture. So kind of overall, what this survey had said was that race and ethnicity doesn't heavily influence whether someone's going to use or not, but the ways that certain surveys are done, way that statistics are taken, can kind of influence that. Another risk factor they talked about, personality factors. So individuals who are more impulsive, or individuals who have a personality disorder or other mental health disorders, are at a higher risk of using, and we're going to go more into that in a little bit. Genetics, so individuals who have biological family members who use, are not only at a higher risk for using, but misusing in a way that's going to lead to a substance use disorder. And reinforcements. So a reinforcement happens when someone engages in a certain behavior and something happens that tells them like, hey, this was good and I want to keep doing it. So reinforcements could happen when someone uses a substance. Like maybe they're having a hard time, they use a substance and it kind of helps them cope, it makes them feel better. That's a reinforcement that, hey, I should keep using, which then means they're more likely to misuse and lead to a substance use disorder. Another reinforcement could be, I feel like I'm not fitting with my peers, and then I use a substance, and hey, now I feel like I fit in. That's a reinforcement then that can lead to a substance use disorder. So let's talk a little bit more about that peer pressure. So when we think about peer pressure, there are two main different types, direct and indirect. So direct peer pressure is kind of that typical peer pressure that we think about when we say peer pressure. So that is having people around you urging you to give in, to do something that they're asking you. So that could be a group of friends, hey, come on, have a drink, vape, come on, do this. That is that direct peer pressure. Indirect, on the other hand, is not coming from really the peers around you. So they aren't saying anything to you. In fact, the peers could not really want you to use, but that individual feels like this is the norm to use. Also referred as environmental norms. So it's kind of what's going on around them that makes them feel like the norm is to use. So for example, say someone has a group of friends and their group of friends all vape, but this individual does not vape. Well, they see everyone else around them vaping, they feel like that's just what everyone does nowadays, they vape. So that's that indirect peer pressure to then vape, to then use. The thing with indirect is it can be difficult and it can be tricky because it can be subtle, the individual cannot know that they're feeling that peer pressure. And it can also be this long-term process happening. And when this long-term process happens of this indirect peer pressure building up, this person can then feel like, well, it's not really that big of an issue. Everyone else vapes, and it's okay. It's what people do. It's not a big deal if I do it too. Obviously, that's going to create a whole new set of problems. Indirect peer pressure can also be tricky for some people because it can be easier to say no to others, but it can be a whole lot harder to say no to yourself. So some individuals who are just at a higher risk of giving into peer pressure are those who are sensitive to rejection. So some people just have a much harder time with any sort of rejection. And if they're having that fear of rejection happening, then they're more likely to just say yes. People who just in general have difficulty resisting. So if they kind of view themselves as like, I just go with the flow, I don't want to cause a problem, I'm just going to do whatever, they're more likely to give into peer pressure. People who also just place a really high importance on their peers. So, what are my peers thinking? What do they think about using the substance? And what do they think about me? If that's really important to someone, then they're more likely to give in and say yes. And also, people who are just deemed as popular are more likely to give in to peer pressure. So we talked a little bit about mental health. We talked a little bit about substance use. Now let's kind of put this picture together here. So as I mentioned earlier, substances are used to cope. So substances are an unhealthy coping skill. People may use it to feel better in the moment. So some things that might be going on that could turn to someone wanting to use substances to cope: negative thoughts, anxiety, feeling irritable, and hopelessness. So people are just having negative thoughts, just feeling down about themselves, about their lives, about the people around them, then that's a time they may use substance to kind of alleviate that. People who are having a hard time with anxiety, again, substances can kind of take away that anxiety, can alleviate that. People who are feeling irritable, it can just kind of help make their mood better. People who are feeling helplessness, it takes those thoughts away. So, some of the issues with this, particularly when we're thinking about adolescents, when we're thinking about teenagers, we know that brains do not develop until about the age of 25, depending on gender. This has a big impact then if someone under that age, and especially under the age of 21, if they're using substances, this is impacting neural pathways. So when the brain is developing, something that really cool that's happening is their brains are kind of making these new pathways, these new connections. Really, really cool. But when someone starts using substances, this is impacting those neural pathways. And this can lead to creating these neural pathways that kind of make even bigger addiction issue going on. Unfortunately, sometimes this can be almost like not complete permanent, but it can be kind of hard to reverse some of this. So substance use, especially with teenagers, is a pretty big and important issue going on. Just some statistics: almost 1/2 of adolescents who are struggling with mental health will use substances if left untreated. So someone who has a mental health disorder, if they are not getting treatment for that, almost 1/2 of them or then more will use substances then. And a study of 10,000 adolescents who were diagnosed with a substance use disorder had at least one pre-existing mental health condition. So that is just saying that there was really this kind of high connection between mental health disorders going on and the use of substances and substance use disorder. So let's just dive into some specific disorders. So let's talk about anxiety. So people who are experiencing anxiety may use a substance to just help calm them down. We can especially see this with social anxiety. So someone is having a hard time just being in social situations, they have social anxiety. Using a substance can help them just cope and feel like they can function in this environment. Pre-gaming, on one hand. So pre-gaming, some people may view as just like, oh, we're just doing this for fun. But some people may be pre-gaming because to them it's like, I'm about to go to this big party and I'm pre-gaming to have fun, but really pre-gaming to help cope with the social situation I'm about to go into. And then we kind of see this problem that's created where, all right, I'm going to use a substance just to cope with this big event going on. Like I'm going to a party, or maybe I'm just nervous about giving a presentation at school or a job interview. So people are using the substance just to cope with those specific situations. That quickly then turns into the problem of, now I'm using substances just to get out of bed in the morning, to kind of cope with even the smallest situations. Depression. So people who are just feeling sad, just down, low energy, they're just not enjoying things they used to find enjoyable. They just don't find it enjoyable anymore. Just generally feeling like just dull and unhappy. They may use substances to kind of alleviate that, to help change their mood. It makes them feel happy. It makes them feel energetic again. It makes them gives them some motivation. ADHD and ODD. So ADHD is attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, and ODD is oppositional defiant disorder. So rather than going into really the specifics of what these disorders are, something I just wanted to bring up is with both these disorders, we see high rates of impulsivity. People who are just kind of likely to experience impulses and give into those impulses. Now, that linked to substance use can create a pretty big issue, because someone who is just having more impulsiveness is more likely then to use substances, and to keep using substances and using it in just more risky ways, and kind of turn into a substance use disorder. Something that's also interesting about ADHD and ODD is studies show that just kind of how these brains work with these individuals, that when they use substances, their brain reacts in a way that gives them more satisfaction than individuals with other mental health disorders or not with any mental health disorders. So that means individuals with ADHD or ODD who use, they are more likely to develop into a substance use disorder because of the way that their brains are kind of giving them the satisfaction, and also because of that impulsivity that's going on. So other just kind of like mental health symptoms that aren't really always specific to a specific disorder, but just kind of can fit into many different disorders. So low self-esteem. To someone who is having difficulty with low self-esteem could then be more likely to use substances. It can help them kind of cope with those feelings. It can help like change their thoughts about themselves. If they're having trouble with peer pressure, it can help them kind of cope with those situations. People who are experiencing suicidal ideations, so thoughts of suicide, can then be more likely to use substances to kind of try to change those thoughts. And then we see some risky behaviors there too, where substances can also be used as a way to harm themselves. Something just in general with substance use, especially when we're thinking about adolescents, we're talking about teenagers, because just how the brains are, substances, how they react to substances can be different than how adults react. So as an example, alcohol. When an adult uses alcohol, generally they kind of slow down. Low energy, they're slowing down. With teenagers, though, we actually see an increase of energy, we see more aggressiveness, and we see more impulsivity. So to kind of paint a picture for what could happen with this, say we have an adult who was drinking, they were misusing alcohol, they were drinking too much, and now they are driving. They may run a red light because everything's going so slow that they're driving, the light changes to red, and the time that they see it, their eyes see it, and that sends a message to their brain, then sends a message to their foot to put their foot on the brake. It doesn't happen quickly enough, so they're running that red light. With teenagers, though, because they're not moving slow, they're moving quicker, they're going to see that red light, and they're going to, because they're impulsive and aggressive, think, I can run this, so they're going to run the red light. So overall, we see how substance use and mental health disorders are just kind of linked up, how substances are used to cope with many different kind of symptoms going on and the issues that this then creates. So overall, using the substances, mental health could feel better in the moment. So in that moment, they could feel like, all right, I can cope with this, I can deal with this. But then after, it can not only make it feel just kind of the same, it can actually make them feel even worse. So they can feel just even more hopeless because neural pathways are being created when anyone uses substances, not only adolescent brains, but anyone. And that can just kind of increase then those feelings of like hopelessness, because it's like substances are then needed just to feel okay. It can also increase suicidal ideation, so those thoughts of suicide. Also, if someone has a mental health disorder and they begin using substances, studies show that then they're just likely to be less engaged in therapy. So they may stop showing up for therapy sessions, maybe they're showing up but they're just not really caring anymore. Also, there is an impact on using substances on if someone is taking a prescription medication. So if someone is taking a prescription medication like an antidepressant for a mental health disorder and then they're using substances, that can kind of make the medication not work. So an antidepressant helps lift someone up, and then they're using a substance that is a downer, it slows them down. Well, you take a medication to lift you up, but then you're using a substance that's bringing you back down. It's like you're not even taking the antidepressant then. And also, even a step further, using substances while on medication can be a health risk. It can even have some like kind of deadly consequences. Okay, so we kind of painted what is a picture, what is the issue, what's the problem going on with mental health and substance use. So now so what do we do about this? So if someone is having substance use disorder, someone is misusing substances, and we want to help, there are certain ways we can help. Since substance use is an unhealthy coping skill, one of the best ways to help is we want to replace it with a healthy one. This is important. If someone is using a substance to cope, we can't just tell them, stop using the substance, and not give them any sort of resources, any tips for what to do instead. So say, example, someone has anxiety and they're using a substance to help them cope and be able to maybe handle school or work. We can't just say, hey, stop using that substance and expect that to be able to work. We want to replace that substance use with a coping skill that's going to target the same stressor, that's going to kind of help with the same symptom going on. So instead of using a substance to cope when you're feeling nervous before you're going to something, maybe we're going to talk about relaxation exercise or deep breathing or self-soothing in a way. So it's really important that we replace that unhealthy coping skill with a healthy coping skill that kind of gives a very similar benefit. If that's not kind of put into place, then someone is not very likely to stick to being substance free. They're more likely to kind of go back to using a substance then because they need something to cope. Something else that's really important, lessening that stigma. So earlier we talked a little bit about that language, about that terminology. It is so important that we're just aware of the language we are using. There is power in words. There's that saying that sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me. Honestly, that's not really true, right? Because words hurt, they can have an impact, they can be damaging, they can be traumatic. So just being aware of the language we're using. So some kind of substitutions we can use. Instead of calling someone an addict, we can say a person with a substance use disorder. Instead of saying someone's a junkie, a person in active use. Instead of saying a drunk, we can say a person who misuses alcohol. And instead of saying a former addict, we can say a person in recovery or long-term recovery. This is important because this is person-first language. And what that means is that they are a person first, that their disorder is something that they have. They are not their disorder. They are not a problem. They have a problem. And again, that's so important because unfortunately we know that individuals who are using, if there's too much stigma going on, then they are less likely to reach out for help, to admit that they have an issue going on and try to seek treatment. And even more unfortunately, studies have kind of proven too that stigma also exists in the healthcare field. So if people are having that stigma, even healthcare workers have that stigma is going to impact the care that they're giving the people they're working with. So we are kind of trying to move away from using certain language. We're moving to using other language to just try to lessen that stigma. Something to note, though, is to kind of follow along with the language that someone is using. So if someone wants to refer to them as himself as a certain way, we shouldn't correct them. If someone wants to call himself an alcoholic, which if they are involved in things like AA, that is kind of an important step, is to call themselves that. So if that's what they're comfortable with, we shouldn't correct them. They can refer to themselves as what they feel comfortable with, as is what's going to be helpful to them. But we just want to be aware of ourselves, of where the language that we are using. So those are just some ways to help. But as always, prevention is key. We don't want to wait until there is a problem to do something about it. We want to prevent people from using substances in the first place. So, first step, resisting peer pressure. So we talked a lot about that direct, that indirect peer pressure and some risk factors. But let's talk a little bit about, well, what do we actually do about peer pressure? How do we say no? So these are just some tips for resisting that peer pressure, just saying no. So being intentional with who you surround yourself with. If you are someone who you feel like, if I am around people using, I'm just more likely to kind of give in and use, then maybe not surround yourself with people who are using. If someone is already in active use, and maybe then they're in recovery, they may have to make some hard decisions in their life of they cannot be around anyone who uses. If you're not someone who has used yourself, then you may not be in a situation. And very likely, you're going to be around, at some point in your life, people who are using. So, kind of saying I'm going to cut out everyone who uses in my life may not be realistic for you. Maybe it is, maybe it's not. But just being intentional with, well, who are those people that you do surround yourself with? Something else that can help, especially if you know you're going to be around people who are using, is something I call the buddy system. So having just at least one other person, say, going to a party with you, who also doesn't use, can be helpful then for you resisting that peer pressure, being able to not give in. If you're going to have even more than one person, that's awesome. But even just one person, me and this person, neither of us are going to use, we can keep each other company, we can kind of help each other through this. Another really important thing is practice saying no. So saying no is really hard for some people. I get it. It's a difficult thing, especially if you're not used to it. So practicing it ahead of time can be helpful. It can kind of lessen anxiety, and it can kind of prevent that, like, in the moment panic. Someone asks me if I want to, say, have a drink. I don't know what to say. What do I say? I'm just going to give in. If you don't want that to happen, practice it ahead of time. Figure out how you're going to say no. Maybe you want to give a certain excuse, you want to kind of come up with something you can say, then that's a good time to practice it. Something also to keep in mind, no is a sentence on itself. You can just say no or no thank you. You don't have to give an excuse if you don't want to. Another way to resist peer pressure, those risk factors that we talked about earlier, being just more sensitive to rejection, having a difficult time resisting, being popular. If you know that that's you have those risk factors, you recognize that, then you may want to work on, what are some ways that I can work against that? If I know that, like, I have a really hard time with rejection, then maybe I want to figure out, kind of where is that coming from? Maybe that's something I want to work on through therapy, or maybe I just want to work on myself. There are things that you can do to kind of lessen what's going on with yourself that can make it then a little easier to say no to peer pressure. But coping with mental health. So this is also important. Again, we don't want to wait till there is a problem, until mental health is so bad and there's a disorder going on and then I'm using substances to cope. We want to try to do things ahead of time to cope with mental health. And again, mental health is something that everyone has, and there are times where we're feeling well, and there can be times that we're struggling. It doesn't always mean we have a mental health disorder, but coping skills are something that everyone can use. So we talked about 4 different symptoms earlier. We talked about those negative thoughts. We talked about anxiety, feeling irritable, and hopelessness. So there are things that we can do to cope with these things. So just a few different coping skills I wanted to talk about with you today. Distraction, at times, can be a very helpful coping skill. So distraction is a good coping skill when you're having a very, very difficult time with something, and it's like, I absolutely cannot cope. Like, I am at 100, I'm having a very difficult time. I need to do something just to completely distract myself now, so I am not thinking about this. So that's going to take up all of your attention. Fortunately, we can't always distract. Sometimes we have to kind of face the issue going on. We do need to problem solve, but there are times when we just need to I'm going to take this problem going on. I'm going to put it on a shelf to handle later. Right now, I just need to do something just to kind of get myself through this moment. So this can look different for everyone. Just whatever can kind of help you, something healthy to do that's not going to hurt you. It's not going to have long-term consequences of distractions. So maybe that's like a hobby, art, or playing an instrument, or playing a video game, or listening to music, or just talking to a friend. Anything that's going to just focus your attention on that and not the problem that's going on. Self-soothing can be another really awesome, helpful coping skill, especially with all those negative thoughts, anxiety, feeling irritable, hopelessness. So self-soothing just refers to doing something for yourself that's going to help soothe you. Generally, that is done through using your 5 senses. So things that you can see, things that you can hear, things that you can taste, things that you can touch, and things that you can smell can be helpful to just kind of bring yourself down a little bit. So there are different ways that you can do this. There's one way when it's just almost kind of use it in a distraction or a mindfulness way, which I'm going to talk about a little bit more in a second. What are just 5 things that I can see around me right now? What are 4 things I can touch? 3 things I can hear? 2 things I can smell? And 1 thing I can taste. One thing that's really cool about your senses is you always have at least one of them available to you. So you can have some great coping skills hey, drawing is an awesome coping skill. I love to do it. It helps me cope. Or closing my eyes and doing a deep breath and a meditation. Super helpful for me. But there will be times that you can't do that. If you're driving, probably shouldn't be closing your eyes. Maybe you're in the middle of class and you can't just kind of take out things and start coloring. You always have your senses with you, at least one of your senses, and you can do something to kind of all right, what are just 5 things I can see right now? Let me list them off to myself. So that's one way to use your senses. But particularly with self-soothing, we're going to use your senses in a way for things that are just comforting to you. And this can be very different for everyone because people find different things soothing. So I have a few pictures there. So maybe a candle. So the smell of your favorite scent can be soothing. Also, just kind of watching the flame can be soothing for some people. Wrapping yourself up in a nice, comfy blanket. Sometimes just what we need. A fuzzy blanket, wrap yourself up. That touch can be soothing. Maybe petting a pet or something, another way to touch and soothe. A fidget spinner, or really any sort of fidget, puppets, kind of anything you like that you can just kind of feel and move around your hands. That can be very self-soothing. Maybe you're going to listen to music, soothing music, or nature sounds, another way to soothe. Maybe you have a favorite comfort food, as long as you're not overeating, which can be an unhealthy coping skill. Sometimes a comfort food is just kind of what we need. Or maybe even a piece of candy or a mint or gum or something can just be a way to kind of focus on that sense. So there are so many different ways to use your senses to soothe. But that can be just a really helpful coping skill for just kind of, especially with anxiety, let me bring this anxiety down. If I'm feeling irritable, let me kind of just bring myself down a bit, take this moment to myself, focus on the sense, just kind of feel calm, comforted. Gratitude is another really helpful coping skill that can help with some of these things. Especially with negative thoughts and hopelessness. It is easy to focus on everything we have that's just not going right, all the negative things. But being able to instead focus on, what are the good things? Some easy ways to do this, before you go to bed at night, just think about, what are just all the good things that happened today? It doesn't have to be big things. It can be hey, I saw a really cute dog walking down the street, or I saw a pretty flower, or I watched this one video and it made me laugh so hard. So kind of being able to instead focus on those things instead of everything going wrong can be helpful, especially those negative thoughts, hopelessness. Mindfulness is another great coping skill. So mindfulness is paying attention to the present moment. So rather than being stuck in our thoughts and things that are going on, just paying attention to something that is in front of you. There's a lot of different ways to do this. Some people like meditation. Some people just like to do this with a hobby. You have that certain hobby that when you're doing that, nothing else exists. It's just you and that hobby. For me, that's like playing an instrument. For people, maybe doing art. It could be a video game. It could be maybe a sport. It could be so many different things. We're just paying attention to just that is a great way. Just like we're not focusing on the negatives. We're just kind of like just living in the moment, not worrying about the future, not thinking about the past. Another way, especially to help hopelessness, is setting and working towards goals. So setting just small goals, realistic and achievable goals and if I don't like things that are going on, then what is just one small way that I can work towards changing this? What is in my control? That's also another important coping skill, just focusing on, what do I have control over? What can I actually change versus what I can't change? So those are just some ways to kind of cope with those things going on. Some other important things is just engaging in meaningful activities. This can be hard sometimes, especially if you are a teenager, if it is summertime, so you're not in school, maybe you don't really have a job or anything. You can spend like all year, like, I'm so excited for summer to come. And summer comes, and then it's kind of like, oh, why am I feeling just so down? Like, no motivation, just sad. It's because we need to engage in a meaningful activity. And meaningful activities looks different for everyone, but just something that like kind of gives you a purpose. Like, I like doing this. This makes me feel good. So sometimes for some people, that's just having some sort of structure throughout their day or routine can be helpful for that. So we would kind of get that feeling from school or a job. Maybe it's volunteering. Maybe it's through TI. So there's lots of different ways to kind of have a meaningful activity, but it is so important for our mental health. We need to engage in meaningful activities. We can't spend a lot of time just doing nothing. It's not good for us. That being said, sometimes we do just need to do nothing. We need those self-care days. We need those relaxation, just shutting down. We absolutely do need those days too, but we need to balance that too with I'm feeling productive, I'm feeling purpose, engaging in something that's meaningful to me. And support's so important. No one can do life alone. We all need people, whether that is family, whether that's friends, whether that's going to be professional support. So that could be like teachers, coworkers, bosses, therapists, doctors. We all need support. We need people who are just there for us. And whether that's just like someone to listen to, someone to problem solve, we do need that support. So if a more serious issue is going on, if you're like, yeah, my mental health is bad, and I think maybe I'm kind of at that mental health disorder stage, if therapy is something that is available to you, it is so helpful. That being said too, you don't have to be like in a crisis to go to therapy. Like really anyone could benefit from therapy. Right? So if you're like, I think therapy would be beneficial to me, you can talk to your school, you can talk to your parents or your guardians, you can talk to a doctor about it. If you are an adult, you have a job. If some jobs have like employee assistance programs that you can go through, if you have an insurance card, you can kind of look in the back. They can use your number you can call to figure out get a list of providers who take your insurance. If you're of school age, there's also school counselors are another option too, just to kind of talk about stuff that's going on. They're just some important numbers. So the crisis hotline is now just 988. It used to be this long number. Now it's so great that it's just a small number because it's a lot easier to remember. If you're in like a really tough mindset, kind of headspace going on, I'm not going to remember a whole long number. 988 is a little easier to remember. You can text or you can call that number. New Jersey has a addiction helpline. It is a 24/7, so it is constantly going. That 988 is also 24/7. And that number I have listed there. So if someone is misusing substances or having a hard time in the state of New Jersey, you can call that number. And this next number is the peer warm line. So a warm line is different than a hotline. So, hot and warm. That crisis hotline it's an emergency. I'm in a really bad headspace. I need help right now. Hotline, get the help right now. The peer warm line is called a warm line because it's not an emergency. It's usually just like I just could really use someone to talk to right now. And it's called a peer warm line because it is answered by individuals who have had their own experience with mental health, with maybe mental health disorder, and they're in a really good place, and now they answer this number. So this is New Jersey's peer warm line. It's not a crisis. They're not gonna call crisis or call the police or anything to your house unless you are saying you're having thoughts of hurting yourself. But if it's just like I just need someone to talk to, like I just want to vent, I want someone to listen, or I just want some advice, and that is a great resource. And something that's so important, whether you're having an issue yourself, mental health, substance use, or people around us, or just kind of overall in general, helping others is so important. If you see something going on, say something. So if you see that someone is having a hard time with their mental health, offer help, offer support, offer resources. Excuse me. So we can offer support. We can just kind of be that shoulder to lean on. We have resources too. We can kind of offer these resources. Same goes if you see someone is maybe using substances. Maybe you're just seeing someone is just acting really different all of a sudden. They're acting down. Behavior has changed. There are ways that we can help. And just overall, just being non-judgmental. So I know we talked a lot about that stigma, lessening that stigma. There is too much judgment in this world. So just trying to be non-judgmental. We all go through problems sometimes. So just kind of being open, being willing to help is so important. So thank you so much. Here's some of my references. I hope that you learned something from this webinar. I hope you gained some just knowledge about the issue going on, some ways to help others, and some ways to help yourself. Thank you.